Beautiful.
Thanks.
Very good.
Let's tuck it this way.
I just got a bet about how high or low I'm these stands going to be.
Uh-huh.
Talk about me aging and the age of decay. Okay. So as I was thinking this morning a little bit about this sermon, I wondered, how many of you know who these two people are? Any idea? She knows. Anybody above the age of 50 here know who these people are? This guy's name is Sam Harris. This guy's name is Bart Ehrman. And all the online things I've been doing, most of the people I talk to know these people quite a bit. Well, especially Sam Harris. Sam Harris is the youngest member of, sometimes they call the Four Horsemen of the celebrity atheists. And there's Daniel Dennett, there's Richard Dawkins, and there's Christopher Hitchens, who's passed away. But he's one of the famous atheists that made quite a splash about 10, 15 years ago. Bart Ehrman, Sam Harris continues to do a podcast, and there are a lot of discussions with his podcasts. He podcasts. I enjoy his podcast. It does a lot of interviews with people. He's disproving Christianity and religion is a very big deal for him, even though he flirts with Buddhism. Bart Ehrman's got an interesting story. Bart Ehrman was raised young. His family was Episcopalian, wasn't terribly into it, but then he became in high school, got involved in an evangelical youth group, became a very convicted, fundamentalist, conservative Christian, very much wanted to study the Bible, went to Moody Institute, and then went to Wheaton College and got deeper into biblical studies, went to Princeton Theological Seminary in New Jersey, and became an outspoken liberal critic of the Bible in some ways, and continues to author quite a few books about the Bible, most of it attempting to kind of debunk and discredit other conservative views about the Bible. And so that made him a very obvious guest on his podcast. And actually, Sam Harris, I was surprised how much he didn't know about the Bible or Christianity. He kept asking Bart Ehrman questions, and Ehrman's, in many ways, is a very competent New Testament scholar. And Sam was kind of eating it up when Bart Ehrman was expressing his skepticism about the resurrection and his skepticism about this and that and this and that. But what really grabbed my attention was Bart Ehrman, towards the end of the podcast, said, it wasn't any of these things that made me give up my faith. I didn't believe in the resurrection anymore, and I didn't believe in certain things about the Bible anymore. I didn't believe any of that. But what really made me give up my faith was that I could no longer believe that a good God would allow this much suffering in the world. And that kind of took Sam Harris by surprise. It was a very, very interesting conversation for that, because Sam Harris expected, kind of being of this celebrity atheist camp, that people make their decisions about what to believe and what not to believe based on facts and reason and all those things. And in my experience, that's just not true. And Bart Ehrman kept telling him, oh yeah, there are many, many very reasonable, intelligent people that believe in the resurrection and are Christian, so on and so forth. And that keeps surprising Sam Harris. But Bart Ehrman said, I just gave it up because I couldn't believe a good God would allow this much suffering. And I always find that interesting, because here's the funny thing. I most often hear that argument, not always, so I don't take this statement too far, but I often hear that from people who, relatively speaking, haven't suffered much. I know other people who, and some people in this church, if I were to sit down and describe to you the kinds of suffering they have endured, and then at the end of it say something like, I never could have endured any of this if it hadn't been for Jesus, it kind of flips the whole thing on its head. But this position by Bart Ehrman is very, very common. And now what's interesting, it's not just common in the contemporary sense. What seems to have changed since the Enlightenment is that atheism or agnosticism seems to have become a publicly acceptable position. And I don't mean that just in terms of sanction. I mean that in terms of it's just easy to believe there isn't a God, like it was impossible to do 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. 3,000 years ago, if you were to say there is no God, in fact, you can read in the Psalms, the fool says in his heart there is no God, that is actually saying that God isn't looking, because almost no one before about the end of the Middle Ages didn't believe the gods didn't exist. Even if you look at some of the Greeks, who we might kind of claim are rather atheists, most of their positions weren't to say that the gods don't exist, but it was more that the gods don't matter, or the gods don't care, or the gods don't get involved, or any of this superstitious stuff doesn't matter. But modernity afforded the mental opinion to give up believing in God or the gods. And those who claim it's emotionally better. And I hear this regularly from people who have given up the faith. They'll say things like, all of this suffering, and I couldn't believe that God would make me do this, so I stopped believing in God, and I felt better. And I always find that to be a very interesting thing, because here's the funny thing. Their suffering didn't go away. What went away was the interpersonal aspect of it. And I don't think this is hard to imagine. For example, if someone accidentally kills a relative of yours and you know it's an accident, you end up saying, you might be angry at someone's negligence, but you wind up saying, oh, that's a tragedy. But if someone intentionally killed a loved one of yours, you have a whole different emotional situation. The end result is the same, your loved one's death. But your relationship with that event is entirely different. And in fact, again, if you go all the way back in the Bible to the book of Job, which is one of the oldest books in the Bible, Job is angry. And what does he want? He wants God to answer for the suffering and the loss that he has experienced. And what's amazing is that is told within the confines of God and Hasatan having a conversation about Job's righteousness. I mean, the whole book is an amazing book. But right there is this question, Bart Ehrman getting up, basically saying, I don't want the universe to be the kind of place that an all-powerful, all-good God would let this suffering happen. Last week we looked at a story which was almost told in a fairy tale way. This week we look at a story which has all the names in it. And we might read this story and think, this sounds contemporary, except for all the features of it which are dramatic and laden with suffering. Sometime later, after the story of Elisha at Dothan, Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, mobilized his entire army and marched up and laid siege to Samaria. If you remember last week, Elisha kind of leads them into Samaria, and the king wants to kill him in Samaria, and Elisha says, no, give them a good meal and send them home to their master. This time, Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, is there with his whole army, and he's besieged Samaria, and there's a great famine in the city. The siege lasted so long that the donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver and a quarter of a cab of seed pods for 5 shekels. Now, translating money is a really hard thing between our world and their world because just everything, values have just changed so dramatically. But a male slave in his prime sold for perhaps 50 shekels. And a donkey's head, you can't think of anything about less desirable for eating than a donkey's head, sells for 80 shekels. And these seed pods that the NIV translates seed pods, some other translations, you'll hear things like dove's dung. It was actually a seed pod of a flower known as the Star of Bethlehem. And it was edible, but it was really nasty. And even that is selling for a high price. And so Samaria is besieged. The people inside are starving. Everyone's desperate. As the king of Israel was passing by on the wall, he's Joram. A woman cried to him, "Help me, my lord, the king." The king replied, "If the Lord does not help you, where can I get help for you? From the threshing floor, from the winepress?" The king's basically throwing up his hands and saying, "God has abandoned us. How could I ever help you?" And then she tells this story. Then he asked her, "Well, what's the matter?" She answered, "This woman said to me, 'Give up your son, so that we may eat him today. And tomorrow we'll eat my son.' So we cooked my son and ate him. The next day I said to her, 'Give up your son so we may eat him.' But she had hidden him." This is a ghastly story. I mean, this is awful. But here we in California, of course, have heard of the Donner Party. And we know that people get to certain extremes. They do awful things. Now what's interesting is that this story is told, of course, in the light of, if you remember, Solomon and the two women and the two babies, and how the great wisdom that Solomon showed. Well, Joram is no Solomon. But he hears this, and Joram isn't as bad as his father Ahab, but he's about as bad as Jeroboam, who built the golden calves. And so Joram seems to still like the worshiping the Lord, but he's doing it in an insufficient way. So he's considered to be a bad king. But there's this great chain of hierarchy, and the king's job is to represent God in the city. And so the woman appeals to him for justice. Well, what should justice demand in this moment? Should he lock this woman up for cannibalism? Should he say, "Find the other woman and cook your son"? It puts him in exactly a completely unwinnable situation, and he doesn't have the wisdom of Solomon. So when the king heard the woman's words, he tore his robes. As he went along the wall, the people looked, and they saw that under his robes he was wearing sackcloth on his body, which meant that he was, in a sense, trying to be a follower of the Lord in some of the crooked ways he knew. And the people could see that he was in torment. So he's not a terrible king who is negligent or taking advantage of his people, but he's not a wise king like Solomon. He's kind of in the middle. He's kind of ordinary, medium bad. As he went along the wall, the people looked, and they saw that under his robes he had sackcloth on his body. And he said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely." That's kind of a standard oath that you can find in the Old Testament often. "If the head of Elisha of Shaphat remains on his shoulders today." And this is kind of like kicking the dog. He's frustrated, he's angry, he's looking for someone to blame, someone handy to punish. Elisha's here. I'm going to behead him for this misery, because God has brought this on all of us. Now again, if you remember last week's sermon, last week the story was told, and you can look it up. No names. It's almost kind of a fairy tale. But this week, it's serious, and it's grim, and it's real life people. Now Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him. The king sent a messenger ahead, but before he arrived, Elisha said to the elders, "Don't you see how this murderer is sending someone to cut off my head?" That's how he talks about the king. That'll give you a little bit of insight into who the king was. "Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door and hold it against him. Is not the sound of his master's footsteps behind him?" And this is really interesting, because last week, an entire raiding party of the enemy, he walks out and says, "This is not the man you're looking for." And he chases and brings them all to Samaria. Where's his power now? He doesn't do any of that. He doesn't resort to a miracle. He seems to know what's going to happen, but probably anybody in the city could have told him what was going to happen. While he was still talking then, the messenger came down to him, and the king said, "This disaster is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" Now, again, given his context and culture, Joram couldn't say, I'm an atheist now. That's just not what ancient people did. So what they'd usually do is, I'm done with the Lord, I'm going to kill his prophets, and I'm going to dust off the Baal temple that my father Ahab made in Samaria, and maybe see if Baal can get us out of this mess. So Elisha replied, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord says. About this time tomorrow, a seah of the finest flour will sell for a shekel. Remember, the donkey's head was selling for 80. And 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria. This time tomorrow, Elisha says. The officer on whose arm the king was leaning said to the man of God, look, even if the Lord should open the floodgates of heaven, could this happen? You see it with your own eyes, said Elisha, but you won't taste a bit of it. Oh, well, now he's got our attention. And the officer has a point, because let's imagine all the scenarios that we would imagine that maybe for some reason some Allied army comes and relieves the city. Even after World War II, General Eisenhower was critically afraid that Europe would starve after the war because nobody in Europe had been farming because of the war. And in fact, things in Europe were so bad after the Second World War that many immigrants, including Dutch immigrants, went to Canada and California because they were starving after the war, and so they came. That's what happens during a war. And so the officer's not an idiot. But what we see here is, in a sense, Joram, who is just kind of a regular guy using religion for whatever he thinks it'll get him. And the officer, who's a pragmatist, says, Elisha, you're out of your mind. Elisha says, this time, not next week or a month from now, this time tomorrow. No trucks to bring in groceries, no railroads to bring in groceries. Things are local. Now, there were 4 men with leprosy at the entrance of the city gate. Now, right away, Joram is at the top of the hierarchy, as is his general, as is Elisha. And they're all pondering the importance of the city. And here you have 4 lepers. They are absolutely at the bottom rung of the ladder. They are outcasts. They can't live in town because of their disease. They're abandoned by their family. They're hanging out at the gate. Nobody gets next to them. Not even the enemy pays attention to them because they're basically worthless, homeless people that everyone just tries to ignore, and if they want to feel better about themselves, will throw a little money at. Now also remember Naaman, a number of stories ago, who was a general from the Arameans who comes down and deals with Elisha, and that whole interchange. Now there were 4 men with leprosy at the entrance of the city gate. They said to each other, why stay here until we die? If we say, we'll go into the city, the famine is there and we will die. If we stay here, we will die. So let's go over to the camp of the Arameans and surrender. If they spare us, we live. If they kill us, we die. Now, this is a purely pragmatic argument. They're basically saying, we got no options. We got 0 opportunities. We have 0 hope for anything. That's our best shot. So, they go. Now, there's a lot of discussion lately about inequality. And it's an important conversation. We should look at inequality for a whole variety of reasons, partly because of justice, partly because of pragmatism, because many surveys will show you the more inequality you get in a country, the more unstable the politics are. If you have a mass of people who are hungry and desperate and have nothing left to lose, well, then they do what desperate people who have nothing left to lose do. Well, this particular scholar decided to do a big study on inequality, and he found something enormously disturbing. Throughout most of human history, about the only way that we've really seen inequality actually handled is disaster. Wars, plagues, where you have mass disaster where massive numbers of people die, suddenly everything gets very equal again. And you see this in the Black Death, and you see this after wars, that the great leveler of human history are not tinkering with the tax code or redistribution of wealth. You know, even if you look at, say, the Soviet Union, a radical experiment of wealth redistribution, you still had the elites living in their little dachas in Moscow while desperately poor people couldn't buy bread at the supermarket. See the same thing in North Korea. Kim Jong-un lives in absolute wealth and luxury, and the mass of North Koreans starve, and the only way to keep stability is repression. But Scheidel's book basically says, well, yeah, that's true, but if you look pretty much throughout human history, it's just disaster that equals everything. So these four lepers, they go out, they're at the entrance of this, and then they say, well, let's just go out. And we're kind of invited to compare the king now, angry, these women eating their babies, to lepers. Who has it better? And so now don't forget Naaman the leper, who didn't want to wash in the Jordan, but his slave suggested, hey, what do you really have to lose? Slaves understand that. People in elite ranks often don't. The king and the officers have revelation now from Elisha, which they pay no attention to, because it doesn't fit their assumptions. And the lepers have no revelation. Let's see what happens to them. At dusk they got up, went into the camp of the Arameans. When they reached the edge of the camp, no one was there, for the Lord had caused the Arameans to hear the sounds of chariots and horses and a great army. So that they said to one another, look, the king of Israel has hired the Hittites and the Egyptians to attack us. So they got up and fled in the dark and abandoned their tents and their horses and donkeys, and they left the camp as it was and ran for their lives. Now it's really interesting too, because even this miracle is just one of confusion. I mean, they hear something and they get spooked and they run, and they're so panicky they don't even get on their animals like horses and donkeys to run away. They just flee and they leave everything there, and after they've been raiding and pillaging and spoiling, what they've actually brought is about the most efficient way to take all of the resources from the surrounding land and plop it outside of Samaria. And the next scene is even funnier. The men who had leprosy reached the edge of the camp, entered into one of the tents, and ate and drank. Everyone in the city is starving. They're complaining to the king that people are withholding their children to be eaten, and these lepers at the bottom of the pyramid are having a high old time in the tents of the enemy. And it makes me think of this scene in The Lord of the Rings when the Ents have just taken over Saruman's castle, and the two little hobbits are sitting on the treasure, smoking and feasting. So here are the lepers. They took gold and silver and clothes and went off and hid them, and they returned and entered another camp and took some things and they hid them too. These little lepers are just working feverishly to grab all the stuff they can, and they're wearing themselves out with the abundance of it all, while the king in the city is starving. Then they said to each other, what we're doing isn't right. This is a day of good news that we are keeping to ourselves. If we wait until daylight, punishment will overtake us. Let's go at once and report this to the royal palace. So they're not even good men. They've received no revelation, but they're sitting in plenty. So they went and called out to the city gatekeepers and told them, we went to the Aramean camp and no one was there. Not a sound of anyone, only tethered horses and donkeys, and the tents left just as they were. The gatekeeper shouted the news, and it was reported at the palace. And as you can imagine, who's going to believe these guys? But they're desperate. I mean, the whole thing is, if it weren't so dark, it would be comedic. So the king got up in the night and said to his officers, I will tell you what the Arameans have done to us. Don't believe Elisha? Don't believe the lepers? They know we are starving, so they have left the camp to hide in the countryside, thinking, They will surely come out, and we will take them alive and get into the city. Get into the city for what? Dying people? One of the officers answered, have some men take 5 of the horses that are left in the city. Their plight will be like that of all the Israelites left here. Yes, they will be like all the Israelites who are doomed, so let us send them out to find out what happens. In other words, the horses are now having the same plight as the lepers. So they selected 2 chariots with their horses, and the king sent them after the Aramean army, and he commanded the drivers, go and find out what happened. And they followed them as far as the Jordan, and they found the whole road strewn with clothing and equipment the Arameans had thrown away in their headlong flight. So the messengers returned and reported to the king. Then the people went out and plundered the camp of the Arameans. So a seah of the finest flour sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley sold for a shekel, as the Lord had said. But what about that officer? Now the king had put the officer on whose arm he leaned in charge of the gate. And the people trampled him in the gateway, and he died, just as the man of God had foretold when the king had come down from his house. And then it just recaps the story, and this is exactly what happened. For the people trampled him in the gateway, and he died. Now what's amazing, if I were to tell these stories to Sam Harris and Bart Ehrman, they would say, these are just legends. But what's really incredible about this story is the only miracle that happened is Elisha prophesying and the Aramean army getting spooked. And in fact, the best way to account for a story like this is exactly the kind of story we expect to see in this world, because people are crazy like this. And crazy things like this happen all the time. And the amazing thing is Elisha keeps his cool through the whole thing. You see, Elisha is not spared, however, by any miracle in this story. And he holds the door against the killers. This is not the man you're looking for. Elisha is basically just like one of us in this story, except he has faith. The advantage of human hierarchy is only a temporary buffer from the catastrophes of this fallen world. In the end, it levels us all. It doesn't matter if you've had a glorious lifetime filled with every advantage and comfort in the world, or a miserable lifetime. Human life is 100% fatal, sexually transmitted disease. There it is. We all die. Like King Joram, we resent God for remaining above it all. We interpret silence for complicity. We feel emotionally beneficial to evaporate God rather than to imagine he's impotent and cruel. And so we just kick the dogs when we can get away with it. Moderns and ancients presume the exclusion of God for our suffering. Ancients and moderns resent God for it. Moderns evaporate God for it and seek our own evaporation at death to be like God. And again, this is always a little bit interesting, because they say, well, when we die, we're nothing. We just have the big sleep. And I think, this is good news. Because the bad news is that you suffer. The good news is, don't worry, soon you'll be extinct. Think, this isn't a good story. Elisha's miracle here is actually one of abundant good news for the poor at the bottom. Isn't it amazing how all of the wealth in the city can't eat it? Poor little lepers partying in the tents of the Arameans, while the wealthy and the powerful have nothing. This is a hilarious story. It's God's exposing the folly of our status pretenses. Oh, they're up here, we're down here. From God's point of view, we're all kind of like this. We're all the same. We just play these petty games one to another. And it is how grace levels all of us. Moral posers like Joram and the pragmatic lepers who are not moral at all. This is finally a story about grace, because our station in this world matters not. Arameans flee in confusion. Lepers feast while the king suffers in unbelief. The commander sees but never tastes. And no one in the story has faith but Elisha, who is not vexed or alarmed, but simply anticipates the city's unearned deliverance. Where would you like to see yourself in a story like this? Because the truth is, this story is not that different from our stories. Because, well, how do we spend our days? Worrying about status and hierarchy, about getting and who doesn't have, and who gets what and who gets where. And in some sense, it's a game that evaporates quickly. Because, generally speaking, once you get to the extremities of life, all of the opportunities you have, gone. What finally matters? One of the interesting things about Jesus is that what everyone wanted Jesus to do is play the world's game. Jesus, go to Galilee, gain a big crowd, gain a big following, give them all weapons, overthrow the Romans, sit on power. And what does Jesus do? He gains a big audience for a while, and then he says things that no one likes and seems to throw it away. And in fact, many of his followers leave, and the most desperate followers, their reason to stay for him is, who else are we going to follow? That's literally what the disciples say to Jesus in John 6. You have the words of life. Where else are we going to get that? And they hang with him, and they march with him all the way into Jerusalem. And Jesus will push them even further because Jesus knows what is about to happen and knows that even they have zero faith and will follow him into the darkest night. And so what he does is he takes bread at the Passover meal, which they all expect, and he breaks it and he says something to them they never could have predicted. On the night Jesus was, what? Betrayed by one of them. He took bread and he broke it. And he didn't say, tonight is the start of the glorious revolution where we overthrow Herod and the Romans and take Jerusalem back for ourselves. He said, the night he was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it. And he said, this is my body, broken for you. They all scratch their head. What? What do you mean your body broken? They'll know soon enough what he means. And he says, whenever you eat this, remember me. What do you mean by that? Well, we're going to see brokenness all the time. Whether you sit on high and have women complaining, why don't you find that other woman so we can eat her child? Or if you're on the bottom and you're a leper saying, we have no options. Jesus saying, God is not excluding himself from your suffering. He is not sitting on high watching and laughing. He is coming down and he's about to be your victim. Well, why would God do that? Well, why do you think God would do that? He's doing it for you. Well, what does that mean I should do? Maybe you should do it for your neighbor. You mean like loving them? Yeah. Whenever you eat this, remember me. Well, if I love my neighbor and it costs me, won't that cost me in this world? Yeah. But why are you scrapping for donkeys' heads and dove's dung in starving Samaria when God says, tomorrow you're going to feast like you can't imagine? I don't believe you. Exactly. What's the message of this? Why don't you try believing? So the table is for you. But only eat it if you believe. Because that's what eating this means. It means we're down with the program. It means we understand what it cost him and what it cost us. And that's how we start living. Not because we're earning anything, but because we actually believe him. The table is for you.